So, Josh, what are we talking about today?
Yeah, so if anyone is listening, you're probably aware that we are almost as divided as ever in modern political history in America. I thought it'd be really important and interesting if we actually this week dove into two-party systems.
Okay, I'm on board. Let's do it.
All right. You're listening to It Might Be Interesting with your hosts, Josh Levy
and John Walsh.
Now, there's an endless amount of information out there on any given topic.
And sometimes you just need somebody who can extrapolate it in a way that might be interesting. So, Josh, have we ever had a three-party system? I mean, as long as I've been alive, it's been two parties. When has there ever been three parties?
Yeah, so the answer to that question is sort of. We did in 1854. We had two parties, the Democrats and the Whigs. Not the wigs you wear on your head, W-H-I-G-S. And the Whigs were the Northern Party. The Democrats were the Southern Party. And the Whigs they fought a lot based on, whether they agreed that slavery should be allowed or not, legal or illegal. And there was a faction of Whigs that really felt like they were pro-slavery. I mean, the argument was, government shouldn't get into it, but let's be real, it's the state's right to own slaves. That's what they were about.
And it was more of the business class within the party, wasn't it?
Well, the business class, it's interesting you mention that. The business class really did side with the anti-slavery, because when they factioned off, the ones who were anti-slavery formed the Republican Party in the Northeast, and the remaining Whigs joined the Democratic Party, which did expand, that grew a larger, not just population, but geographically took up a little more space there in the South. And in the North, a lot of people, they were against slavery, which did lead to a civil war. And during that civil war, the Republican Party, not only the Union essentially, they won the war, but during that time, the South, what helped deepen this visceral hatred for the North was the South economically. It had flipped the country. Like, the South was doing so well because that was where the farmlands were. That was where, slavery.
Cotton, tobacco.
Talk about, that's free labor. I mean,
yeah,
that's putting it lightly. It's like brutal labor. But they were doing better economically. But then because of the war and, you have to make muskets, you got to make the rifles, you got to make the cannons, you got to, make the forts. So the North actually organized a bit better with all of that, and people made a lot of money.
Off of war profiteering.
War, yeah. And so by the end of the war, the South was basically in ruins because the North was like, look, yeah, there were some battles in the North, but in the Union, but they said, no, we're not letting them come here to our home. We're going to take the fight to them. They pushed harder south, helping, ruin economy, not saying, oh, poor slave owners, but saying
right.
Like it really decimated that economy in many ways, and then they looked up at the North and saw these Republican bigwigs, just smoking their cigars, enjoying it. And since then, the ideologies over time have flipped in either minor ways or major ways. But since then, we have largely had just a Republican and Democratic Party.
So what I love about that history is the Republicans were known as the Liberal Party of the North, and the Democrats were the Conservative Party of the South.
Right.
They stayed where they were, but they switched the banners of which they held over themselves over the subsequent 100 years. And there's two events more than anything that led to that. One was the Great Depression, wherein a Democrat came into power and put a lot of large government programs in that made a lot of conservative Democrats in the South start to distance themselves from FDR. The other thing about those large government programs was the institution of the minimum wage. And if white workers now had to compete for jobs at a minimum wage with black workers, they took that as an affront. And so they slowly started trickling out of the Democratic Party. The second blow was the civil rights movement.
Right.
And that kind of solidified the Democratic Party, the banner moving to the north, and the Republican Party moving to the south. But my question for you is, why didn't a third party come out of that?
Well, I mean, basically a lot of that comes down to social issues. So there are a lot of people who maybe aren't single issue voters, but they do have those issues that are just their litmus test, like where like pro or anti-abortion. And so what would happen is one party, like the Republicans, which kind of had some moderates and people kind of waning left and right, they came out and said, we're anti-abortion, and that basically like secured their evangelical Christian vote, and, you know, would say things like family values, which, you know, yes, of course, family values, nobody denies that's important, but when you say things like that, you are courting a type of voter, you are, you know, and then, you know, the left, with things like the Civil Rights Act and everything, became a party of, you know, disorder, not in a bad way. Like, they were about the hippie movement of be you, do you, like, fight against the system and, you know, part of the, you know, disrupt the system. And
they were more revolutionary.
Yeah, and conservatives were more like traditional. And so even though like there are economic policies that have changed, there have been foreign policies that have changed, there have been fiscal policies that have changed, I think mainly what has shifted and just secured, prevented, you know, any type of shift is, first of all, the social issues, like, hey, you know, this Republican has promised they are against this. Why do I need to vote for an independent who also says they're against it? You know, even if a Democrat says, look, I'm open to discussing banning abortion, to them that's not nearly as good as the Republican who says, ban it. Right. And same on the other way around. Like, no Democrat would be like, oh, you know, it's okay that they want to maybe ban abortion. It's
right,
like,
yeah.
no.
There's a line in the sand.
Yeah.
And you're right. It's usually on these social topics. And when I listen to modern conservatism, I see its correlation to the South and the Confederacy. You know, during the Civil War, the Northern soldiers very easily burned Baptist churches in the South. The South had a harder time burning Catholic churches in the North because they were predominantly made of stone, whereas these Southern Baptist churches were all made of timber. So the idea that the North is coming down here and attacking our beliefs, and the North is trying to take our guns away and infringe upon our rights, that's still very much a predominant feeling within the Southern culture, and it's very, you can't say it's not American. It is American. It's just an unfortunate part of American history. But it is a rallying call and sort of a social fabric within, you know, Southern communities.
Well, yeah, and it's funny you mention that because there are also ways where they're still in the same route. So, like, for instance, the Republican Party, you're right, was the Union Party and everything, but today, would you say which party is more like pro-business profit?
Well, definitely the Republicans, I would think.
And during the Civil War, which one was all benefiting and from the profit and all pro-business profit?
Yeah, still the Republicans.
Yeah, so I mean, there are roots in both regional, like
economic,
social, conservatism, but there's also roots in. I think it's almost like the parties stayed true to their economic and, you know, foreign policy and stuff like that, in many ways, not all, but I think it was largely after the Civil War, suddenly black people, which was a large portion of the South, had the right to vote.
Yeah.
And now it was like, oh, there's a party that is saying, like the Democrats, FDR comes in and they start saying, look, maybe we should start thinking about more, rights, equal rights. It was still a very segregated nation. Suddenly,
Plus Jim Crow on top of that.
Yeah, it piques the interest, starts courting a lot of black voters, who, I say, like, to their credit, I hate playing like the identity politic thing, but I think to their credit have historically been like nonpartisan, not bipartisan, but they have historically been kind of like, screw the party name. I'm neither blue or red. Like, I'm going to vote based on what I think is best for me.
So the other thing you were talking about was how there's a larger population of African Americans in the South. And you can do one of two things, basically. You can attract those people to vote for your party, or you can kind of push them away and restrict their voting, which unfortunately is what it sounds like the way the conservative movement has gone. But it's not mutually exclusive to the African American community. Right now, we see it with the Latino and Hispanic community. In the early part of 2000, we saw it with the gay and lesbian community. And there's an attack on women's health care as well that is just pushing these people out of the Republican Party. And in 2012, the then head of the Republican National Committee, Reince Priebus, decided after Romney had lost, let's look at where we're failing. And the two groups they identified was Hispanics and women. And so in 2013, they called themselves the Gang of Eight, got together with the Democrats and said, let's write immigration reform. And the base of the Republican Party said, absolutely not. And they killed it before they could even discuss it. So I think the horizon for the Republican Party is very easily seen at this point. They've lost with most demographics and pushed them out of the party. And I'm just curious if you think they're going to be able to survive.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. And honestly, I do think, I know this is like slightly off of that, but I do think it is absolutely critical for leaders on both sides, for people to just sit down and be like, we have to stop going after the racial, ethnic, religious, gender, whatever. We have to stop trying to just go right for the heart of that voter base, because it's only dividing us further, and then what it does is I think it's almost like, I hate to use such an analogy that almost sounds like it trivializes issues, but it's like, the political system is a pizza that's cut in half, but their rhetoric and what they're doing is almost, it's like they're creating more and more slices, and so more and more people are like, well, I don't really fit here, like I'm the slim segment of this, and the more you cut it, the more slices you cut, the smaller of a slice you are, the less represented you feel you are, and the more marginalized you feel even in your own party.
Yeah, and I'm going to push back on that just a little bit.
Okay, all right.
I think that you definitely see that on the Democratic side.
Yeah.
They have a huge tent, and they're trying to get as many people in to the point you don't know what they stand for.
Right.
They stand for so much. It's like, well, what are you about? We're starting to see themes within them coagulate, right? And so you see the environment is becoming a key issue, which I couldn't be happier about. And then you see, wealth and income inequality as being a top priority as well, because that has certain racial implications. It has workers' implications and so on. Whereas the Republican Party, I don't see them slicing and dicing. I see them just coming into one big piece. And that piece is just by default slimming and slimming and slimming. So if you look at like what we talked about in episode 1 with the religious base of the Republican Party, and that is dying out by generation, And then at the same time, they're pushing certain ethnic and religious groups out of their party and saying you're not welcome, as well as, sexual orientation being pushed out as well. To me, that's not slicing and dicing. That's trying to hang on to that one piece of pizza. Whereas the Democrats are trying to figure out, how do we market to all these people that are getting pushed out? So I think to an extent, you're right, there is slicing and dicing, but I see that more on the left than the right.
Yeah, I actually agree, and I'd like to get your thoughts. I think this is actually we're seeing it's causing more harm than good to the left, in a way where I know there are a lot of disaffected people which are quickly branded as, oh yeah, those are like the working class white folk who, are a smaller percentage, so ignore them kind of thing. It's like, no, there's actually millennials every year are growing more and more affiliated with Republican Party now.
Yeah, there are millennials that are joining the Republican Party, but you have to look at what is important to them.
That's true.
And the number one issue for young Republicans is climate change. From a party, if they're joining in that party, they're joining a party probably for different reasons, but eventually that party is going to have to come to grips with climate change, because the new largest voting bloc that's entering into it is serious about it. So is the Republican Party going to continue in its present form? I don't see any way that it can. Right. But, and just marketing and trying to figure out, how do we grab these demographics and add them to the toppings of the pizza, so to speak. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's working. I think what we're going to see in the future is the Republican Party will collapse, and the Democratic Party will split in half, and because it can't appeal to everyone. Mm-hmm. And a new party will come out of it. And the way I see it, the number one group that is going to and needs to be represented is Hispanic and Latino. Josh, I remember reading in 2016's election that Charles and David Koch were prepared to donate $100 million to the Republican candidate. Can you illuminate us as to what the percentage of money in politics looks like, how much of it's coming from the public versus individual, wealthy people? What's that look like?
Here's some numbers. There's a article in Vox. I know Vox does tend to be a left of center organization and publication, but this has some graphs, some charts, and data from the Center for Responsive Politics, which is an organization that is bipartisan. It is
neutral. Yeah,
neutral. Liberal and conservatives who are hawkish about responsibility and spending and finance. So in 97 to 98, 1997 to 1998, about $4.5 billion adjusted for today's inflation adjustment. So $4.5 billion was spent on elections and lobbying. In 2012, between 2011 and 2012, that number rose to about $12.5 to $13 billion.
So it tripled in a decade.
That's true. And not only that, get this, 0.26. Now, let me repeat that. 0.26% of the population is donating 68% of the money raised by politicians. 68% of the money politicians have raised and received comes from 0.26% of the people.
So those with the deepest pockets are the ones contributing to politics bar none more than the general public.
Exactly. And since elections are won by the margins, they aren't won in They typically don't see like a Nixon victory where they win basically every state, or a victory against Mondale, Reagan victory. It's rare for that. They are usually won by the margin, like by a field goal. And so because of that, I mean, they aren't targeting the 99% to, coax them into voting or whatever, or donating. This is 0.26. They're going for like a fraction of a percent. They're thinking, if I get these 2 Wall Street donors, that might be enough to get that game-winning field goal. If I get...
Yeah, it's incredible.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I scrolled down a little bit, and I'm looking at the percent of money raised by small donors in Obama versus Romney. And Obama got a lot more contributions that were under $200 in both state and federal or whatever. Romney got a lot higher portion of contribution that was $1,000 and up. So, people that contributed higher amounts to Romney, and he raised a hell of a lot of money.
He did, yeah.
But it didn't translate into victory. So what happens, when you're spending this money and you don't get your result?
Not just that, let's not forget. I mean, now things look different because since 2016, President Trump has raised, I think, a record amount of money for the 2020 election. In 2016, Hillary had a much bigger war chest, and yes, she won the popular vote, but considering everything, including the war chest, and the electability, the experience, the steady hand, all of that, like, there was no reason to lose the election. She had far more money to spend and ended up losing. And then you look at things like Bernie Sanders raised a record amount of money from a record number of donors in the 2016 primary, from an average of, I know he beats a dead horse by saying this, $27 per donor. And he raised more money than Obama did in the primary.
Well, speaking of Obama in the primary, I'm seeing that his top 2 donors, Fred, I don't know how to say his last name. Is that Eichner?
Eichner, yeah.
Eichner. He donated $14 million, and Michael Bloomberg just over $13 million. So together, the top 2 donors in the Obama years was $27 million. And if you look at the top donor in the Republican Party, it was Sheldon Adelson, the casino magnate, and he spent $92 million, 3 times as much as what Obama's top 2 donors gave.
And not just that, look at number 2 and 3, and take a look at those numbers. So we have Harold and Annette Simmons. So we have Harold and Annette Simmons in chemicals and metal industry, almost $27 million donated. And then we have Bob Perry from home building industry, about $23.5 million. And so the top 3, you have to get to the top, through the top 3 before you even get to Fred Eichner, in the Democrats. And even then, like the number 4, Joe Ricketts in banking, $13 million. That's, the person number 4 on the conservative spending would be, like the top or, second most in the Democrats and the liberal.
So I guess what that brings me to is, if the majority of the contributions within the Democratic Party are coming from individual contributors, and then, like more of a grassroots thing, and you look at the 2020 election and how the party set that up, they had to have a minimum amount of individual contribution in order to make it onto the stage for the debates.
Right.
And those that fell short were eliminated. And we're seeing candidates just this last week. John Hickenlooper dropped out, former governor of Colorado. We'll probably see some more drop out in the future. But it seems the Democratic Party is moving more towards what I've thought should be implemented all along, which is a publicly funded election. And I know that there's people that are listening to this right now going, nothing public. You
Right.
know? But
Thanks, Stalin.
Yeah, exactly.
Tell us more. Yeah.
Yeah, but let me explain how it works, and maybe you'll go, you know what, that's not a bad idea. The way a publicly funded election works is when you go to your employer and you say, hey, I want to fill out a publicly funded form. And what that is you say, I want $1 taken out of every paycheck, and that will go to an election commission fund, right? And every 2 years, you can pull that money and give it to state or local representatives or however you see fit in sort of like a voucher system. You paid into it and you pay out of it. No one else touches it. And you'd say, well, $1 or $2 a month or, per paycheck, like what difference does that make? Well, let's do the math on it. $1 to $2 a month or per paycheck. Let's say $1 per paycheck. That's 26 paychecks a year. It's $26 a year. That's $52 every midterm. And in the, let's say it's a presidential election and you didn't spend anything in the midterms, that's now $104 that you have to spend on the presidential election. In 2016, I think it was 130 million or 120 million people voted. That's $6.2 billion.
Yeah, so even if half of them did, that would be like nearly double or like double what each candidate.
So, and here's the other thing about how that works. If you're a politician and let's say you're running for a Senate seat and you take, you decide I'm going to take private donations from industry. And your opponent, she decides she's going to take publicly funded money from this program. I cannot take money from both. I can only take it from private individual contributors. She can only take it from the election fund. Who does she report to?
The people, I would say no matter who you are running for office, you report to not the voters, but your donors.
Right. We always joke that, senators should have to wear jackets that look like a NASCAR.
Which I think half joke about. I think it would be a great way to. But anyway, go on. Yeah.
But yeah, if you knew who their contributors were, you would be like, well, we know who's paying for that candidate. Right. Whereas if it's coming from the public and that's who you respond to, that's whose needs you're going to address because you want that money to come back in the next election. Right. The same for the private contribution. You want to continue to receive those private contributions. You're going to craft policy that works for that. And we see this grassroots in America that is doing all these individual contributions to Buttigieg and to Warren and to Sanders and O'Rourke. And it's all this grassroots stuff. And yeah, the party kind of set it up that way, but they set it up that way because they knew it's more powerful and more democratic, and more results will get driven, to the people if it's done that way.
It's like, well, it would suddenly create a faction and split up the money, and it might promote and encourage, these billionaires to donate more, which is one concern, is like they might up it and Koch brothers would be like, here's $1 billion. Someone bagging groceries down the road, their money, their donation is going to be no less important than mine at my salary that is, better, not millions, not the Koch brothers,
right, yeah. But
it is better than someone bagging groceries. And that is going to be such a powerful thing, both politically, it's going to send a message, it's going to, for people who feel like the system has left them behind, think about like $1 out of each paycheck, $1, and suddenly, like that alone is a tectonic shift in how much they got to pay attention to you and how much you matter now.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing about this topic is the solution to money in politics is to get more money into politics.
All right, John. So I was thinking, based on a lot of the research we've done, I thought maybe we should take a look at examples around the world of both two-party system-driven nations as well as multi-party systems, leaving out, of course, single party like North Korea. I think we can agree on the viability and
Sure.
whether or not we want to have a government like North Korea. So let's look at two-party versus multi-party and kind of evaluate viability, pros, cons. Is that something that we really should invest our time into?
Okay, where do you want to start?
So let's take a look at two-party systems. So basically a two-party system, how we'll define it is because pretty much every country has more than two parties. Even here we have Green Party, Libertarian Party, and even more parties than that. So, but a two-party system is a country that is governed where two parties retain the majority of control. So 51% or more of political control, power, influence, political seats, things like that are held by two parties.
Okay.
So, for instance, we have United States, of course, but then you have, Jamaica and Malta are two-party systems, but, United Kingdom and Australia, the reason I personally, they kind of are on the fence between two or multi-party.
Yeah, I've never seen the UK as a two-party system.
Right, and because they have third and fourth parties that are more viable or respected or get more attention and votes than third and fourth parties here, but they do consistently have two parties, the Tories and the Labour Union or the Labour Party. Those two parties consistently basically decide the policy. Those are the ones who consistently write the laws, with a few exceptions in there with like the Liberal Democratic Party. But those are the two.
Scottish National Party.
Scottish National, yeah. So they have several. Same with Australia. But that essentially is the list.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about the parliamentary system to me is, they have all these multiple factions and so forth, but the whole point of forming a government in Britain is to build consensus with these other parties, and it's kind of like a rugby scrum.
Right.
You push the policy based on your coalition that you've built, and if people start falling off that coalition, then it collapses the government, and they appoint a new prime minister based upon the newly formulated ideas. And I've often wondered if that's a better system. I don't personally think it is, but it is an interesting one to watch unfold.
Right, it is. It is. You see a lot more of the discourse in a good way. Like, you can see heated political debates in Parliament in Britain.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many times I wish George Bush would go down in front of Congress and get yelled at during the Iraq War like Tony Blair was.
Yeah, I mean, like George Bush about Iraq War, President Obama about Wall Street donation, Donald Trump about like the camps at the border that are being, that are clearly, no matter what side of the aisle you're on, you have to sit back and look at it and think, we can do better. That's not America. Like, where you have to go down, you get yelled at, and then when you try to defend yourself, you're sometimes met with quite a raucous boo. Or
if you have a third party in the mix, just like in a parliamentary system, it's about siphoning off those votes to build coalition. And if you have, the Democrats and the Republicans, and a viable third party comes up, even if it's a powerhouse, eventually one of those three is going to start seeing its votes siphoned off. Right? Whether it's the Democrats, the Republicans, or the new party.
Right.
The fight is over the third option in this country, and it's always kind of boiled down to that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know if a parliamentary-style multi-party system could work in the United States just because the rest of our government isn't set up that way.
My favorite pro-argument in favor of a two-party system that I know we're going to jump into, I thought, if you want, we can dive into this a little more, but we can...
Yeah, let's look at the pros and cons of the two-party system and see, is there a benefit to it?
Yeah, you bet.
So what's your favorite pro to the two-party system.
All right, so my favorite pro, and honestly, like, I gotta tell you straight up, full disclosure, before researching this topic, the reason I was so flippin' excited was because this was like the first topic we've done where, some of them have kind of broadened or, added depth to an opinion I had and some nuance, but this kind of flipped it a little bit. Like, I was gung-ho in favor of just like two parties suck, get a third party in here that to, change the game and everything. Here's one argument that kind of tipped it in favor for me just a little bit in the pro segment is it is a much more stable system to prevent extremists from having actual power as members of Congress, meaning, yes, people are probably thinking like, whoa, there's a huge rise in extremism and blah, blah, blah. But when you think about it, like, yes, you might tie that to the Republican Party, but that alt-right, group, fascist group, is a tiny, tiny drop in the bucket.
Right. I think my favorite pro of the two-party system is it brings politics down to the local level. And if there's already sort of a general consensus as to what a party stands for, if you know that you're a conservative and you hold to conservative values, you're gonna run in the Republican Party most likely. And if you're more left of center and you feel a progressive tax code is more important, then you're gonna run as a Democrat. And it gets more people involved at that local level and kind of makes the legislative process a little bit easier because your coalition's already built once you get into the House of Representatives or the Senate or whatever body you're running for, or even if it's just city council. So, you take the party coalition that's already established, and if you win and you win a majority, then your work is already kind of cut out for you. And I've always liked that about the two-party system.
Yeah.
We mentioned our favorite pro. What's your favorite con against the two-party system? Do you have one?
I sure do. And this, actually, to be honest, like, I read through several articles that did offer some pretty good pros and cons, but none of them really listed this as a con that to me is. And a pretty big one is a two-party system simply encourages and enforces big money being funneled into just two sides, and if you are anywhere in the middle or anywhere lower on the economic ladder than the top 1 or 0.01% of donors who matter, if you aren't part of that 1% who matters to politicians as the donor class, then you are not getting representation. As of now, as of the current laws, as of the current system, you are not being represented, period, end of story. And so if we did have something like, whether it is the public option, public funded option you mentioned, or some other solution, to me, the moment we can have that, it'll break up the money, and then working and middle class Americans will suddenly start to matter in politics again.
Yeah, and I think in many ways I agree with you. I think the favorite con, like opposition to it that I have, is that it solidifies a ideological base. There's a litmus test that you have to sort of endure to run into a party. The Republican Party has kind of hardened around that litmus test, whether somebody is a true conservative or not.
Right.
And the Democratic Party, you're starting to see a stifling of new ideas. So if you take the presidential candidate Andrew Yang, who has ideas about universal basic income, those aren't ideas that resonate with the more establishment Democrats. And so you see a stifling of ideas that I don't say that I agree with Andrew Yang, but it's certainly a fascinating conversation.
Right.
So, why not have that conversation? Well, within a two-party system, we don't have time for that get on board, get in line, and let's put our agenda through, and then we'll talk about it. And that, I think, is stifling of democracy.
To engage in this discussion on two questions we have. So John has a question, I have a question I would like to ask and would love to hear your thoughts on. So go for it, John.
So my question is the two-party system inevitable in the United States? And will changing the funding mechanism for it create more parties?
All right, that's actually interesting. I'm curious to see what people think about that. And I'd say my question would be, am I naive thinking that the two-party system is the problem? And, would it solve anything in the end? Or would we be kind of back to square one? So that's what I would love to ask, if we are at a point where we got to break up the big parties, or if, that's nonsense, it's not going to change anything, and let's focus our energy elsewhere.
And hey folks, you can find us on social media at IMB Interesting on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter.
Yep.
You've been listening to It Might Be Interesting. Please join us next time.
And we'd love to hear any thoughts, questions, feedback, and even episode suggestions you might have. So if you do have any, please send it over to thoughts@itmightbeinteresting.com. And you can also check out our other episodes at itmightbeinteresting.com.
Today's music was provided courtesy of the band The Labor. Full disclosure, I'm a member of the band. You can check out all of our stuff on iTunes, Spotify, or SoundCloud, or wherever you stream music.